Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you today and to be invited to be a part of this panel. I've set up my talk today with, I used a bit of a music metaphor, and I'm the least qualified to use such a metaphor. In fact, I took piano lessons when I was younger for a couple of years, and it didn't take too long until my piano teacher went to my mother and said, "It'll save you money and save me time if Jason stops taking piano lessons." So I'm necessarily, like I said, not the best qualified to use a music metaphor, but I've set this up today with a bit of a decrescendo metaphor or approach. We'll hit in these first couple of slides the main points, and we'll capture some of these key ideas of what I'd like to highlight, and then I'll spend the remainder of my time sharing with you some evidences and some facts and ideas that tie into that. The first thing I'd like to highlight is to mention that I'll be pulling a lot of my data and my information today for you from the Not Yet report, a report that actually Brad and I published together with some co-authors. And you can find the entire report at 20somethingmarriage.org. And so similar to Dr. Fagan, we'll move through some figures and some ideas, but also leave to you a resource where you can turn and get into the data and into the findings in a bit more detail. I would like to talk today and emphasize and dig down into a specific issue around the delay of marriage that we see in the United States culture, but I'll just use United States data today to say that we also have a trend happening in most of our modern societies and patterns that we see across the globe. And so we can see this in a variety of ways in a variety of cultures. And this is probably not too much news to anyone in the room. This has been well documented and well understood that we have seen over the last few decades a significant and indeed historical change in the median age of marriage in the United States. And to the point now that we are at all-time historic highs on these figures and these patterns. And if we keep in mind our memories of our old math classes and our old statistics classes, right? The median is telling us the split point of the population, that 50% of the population is above that while 50% is below. We are quickly approaching and continuing to climb as a culture towards a pattern where half of our marriages are occurring after the age of 30. Quite different than what we've seen previously. Now, typically, this pattern is understood and talked about generally, I believe, with a positive connotation, that this has had a positive implications for us, that this is progress. Particularly with our focus today with this panel on economics and career readiness and career preparation, by and large, it's generally assumed that delayed marriage is a positive trend related to these aspects of life. However, there are current trends that are challenging this assumption, and that's what I'd like to talk a bit about today, particularly when we include, as Dr. Fagan has already started to highlight for us, marriage formation and family stability factors. That there may be some trade-offs here in what we're pursuing, and we're actually getting the opposite of what's intended. Why is this happening? I believe there's three key misunderstandings that are leading to our societal misunderstanding of the implications of these patterns. One, we tend to be focusing and interpreting this trend looking only at the college educated in our society. I'm going to show you a number of places where if we broaden out and look across the social economic spectrum, we start to see some very different patterns, reminding ourselves as well that those that are not college educated are the vast majority of the society. And so as we look at those segments of the population, we're often not fully appreciating consequences and impacts for them on the delay. Perhaps the biggest thing that I'd emphasize to you today is that the very term delayed marriage is in all likelihood a misnomer. And our conversation about delayed marriage is missing the key point that what we're seeing for many in society today is not delayed marriage, but what we'd better call resequenced marriage. That while marriage has been delayed, sexuality and childbearing has not. And when they don't move as a whole package, that's a very different scenario. And we also see a segment of society where we see a pattern of marriage foregone, where it's not just delayed, but it's now no longer a part of the life course. The other misunderstanding that we have is that we tend to fall into the belief that age equals maturation. And while we're in our teenage and childhood years and brain development and other things are happening, chronological and maturational age do tend to match up very well. But as we start to move into adulthood, chronological age is no guarantee of movement in maturational age. So simply assuming that older is better or older means more prepared actually starts to miss some of the most important factors that help people be marriage ready. So let's look first at a few direct consequences. We'll look at the pattern here of when we look at age of marriage related to income, as we look at economics today. As you see on this graph, you see three clusters or groups. The less than high school educated, the high school dropout population, the high school or some college, what we sometimes refer to as middle America. This is the community college sample of our culture, and then our college graduate and professional groups. And breaking this down by those then who married under the age of 20, those who married between 20 and 23, 24 to 26, 27 to 29, and 30 plus, reminding ourselves where the majority of those patterns are happening in our culture. Now, we do see here when it comes to women's personal income, some advantages that have occurred connected to the delayed age of marriage. But where have the advantages primarily happened? For college-educated women. We do see a bit of a gradation there as marked in the far right of the graph. If we look at the less than high school and the middle America populations, we don't see nearly as much of advantage or benefit occurring because of that. Although that's assumed that's the primary benefit that's going to happen with delayed age of marriage. And as I'll show you in a minute, even the advantages we see for the college graduate population may come with some degree of trade-off when we look at some of the other indirect factors. With men, however, we start to see a very different pattern. Again, we see a flat pattern in our lower educated groups, but then among our college educated population, we see an interesting pattern emerge. And I'm sure Dr. Wilcox will be able to illuminate and highlight more around these advantages and benefits we see related to marriage, even in these direct measures of economic income and those benefits. That we actually see that it's the men marrying in their mid to late 20s that are the highest income earners, not those that are in the 30-plus marriages. So the benefits directly start to tell a more complex story than we typically imagine or re-envision. But the real storyline starts to emerge as we start to look at indirect measures of economic consequences and benefits and harms. This graph ties into some of the data that Dr. Fagan was just highlighting. What you see with this orange, with the purple line here, is that median age of first marriage for women in the United States. It's the same trend line I showed you on the first graph. But now mapped on top of that with the orange line is the median age of first birth in the United States. We document in the Not Yet report a phenomenon that we labeled the Great Crossover. 15 or 20 years ago or so, we saw a significant demographic change in this country that was rarely recognized and has rarely been talked about. But the crossover now is where the median age of birth in this country is lower than the median age of marriage. Again, back to the idea, not delayed marriage, but resequenced marriage. And the bar graphs that you see at the bottom are the corresponding patterns of non-marital childbirth rates in the country as a whole. And so as we see this connection and association with family formation, we start to think about what impacts does this have on economic well-being, particularly the well-being of children. Now again, this phenomenon becomes even more significant as we look at the pattern based on different social economic groups. This is the same data, this is the same trend line, but here we're looking at college graduates. The triangled line represents the median age of first birth, the circled line, the median age of first marriage. Among college graduates, we see a pattern that scholars have referred to as the success sequence that has continued for some time. So as the age of marriage has gone up, the age of first birth has tended to go with it. And the relatively rate of non-marital childbirth sits much lower than the national averages, although it has quadrupled in the last 40 years. But when we look at the less than high school group, we see that the lines are completely reversed and the difference is growing between them. That median age of first marriage is moving further and further away from the median age of first birth, tying then into a well over 80% rate of non-marital childbirth. But the fascinating story in the largest segment of society is when we look at that middle America group. That 60% of the population or so group, this is where the crossover has happened. And we see a pattern here where the disadvantages are occurring for the individuals and groups who can least afford these disadvantages. The family decline is most significant in that way. What happens when we look not just at family formation, but we look at patterns of divorce? One of our longest standing understandings and the arguments and rationale behind delayed marriage is, doesn't this lead to better marriages? These are more mature individuals, better prepared, more life situated. When we look at the data from 20 years ago, that argument tends to make a bit more sense, but not nearly as late in the lifespan as we talk. What you see here is data from 1995 showing the association between age of marriage and the probability of marital disruption, the probability of divorce. And you see that as people do get older, at least up until the early 20s, there's a significant association. We've long talked as a culture about the harms and potential risks of teenage marriage and young marriage. But we see that most of that benefit flattens out, but we do see it continuing in that direction. But look what happens if we move forward 20 years and look at the new data of what we see in our culture today. And this comes from Brad's work together with Dr. Wolfinger and the Institute of Family Studies. Released this study recently showing that if we look at the more recent data, the trend patterns have changed significantly. And the plus 30 marriages now we see rising in their likelihood of divorce and of disruption. The older is better concept and idea starts to have significant challenge when we look at the trends and the patterns here. Now, I'd like to spend my time, though, I think where the key of this is getting to the question of why. And if we're to address this as a culture and as a society, getting into the reasoning and the logic behind why these patterns are being followed and the arguments that we have in favor of delayed marriage, particularly well into the 30s and later, are having what I would call paradoxical influences. Using this term, what we're highlighting is that a paradox is a proposition that, despite apparently sound reasoning, leads to a conclusion that is senseless, logically unacceptable, and self-contradictory, right? And I believe that's what we have in our culture today, is the emergence of what we could call marriage preparation paradoxes, where these behaviors are being engaged in not for the abandonment of marriage, not for leaving marriage, but many would argue, and the young adults that we see would report, that it's indeed patterns they're following because they believe it'll strengthen their marriages. So the best everyday example I use of a paradox, it's a little bit like turning the jar lid the wrong direction. As you believe you're trying to loosen that jar lid and actually get closer to what you're trying to open up, a paradox means you're actually turning it the other direction and making it tighter. You're getting the opposite that we see. What are some examples of marriage preparation paradoxes in our broader culture? Well, perhaps the best prototype example is the cohabitation paradox. Far and away, the primary reason that young people and their parents and families give today for encouraging cohabitation prior to marriage is that it is a test drive. It is a way to lessen the risk and chance of a later divorce. In fact, many of our best and brightest minds in the social sciences back in the 1980s were claiming that we'd see a huge reduction in the divorce rate because of the climb that we see in cohabitation. The cohabitation would act as this Darwinian survival of the fittest mechanism that would weed out the weak relationships and only the strong ones would ultimately survive and divorce rates would decline. 30 to 35 years of studies have shown just the opposite. Cohabitation before marriage has historically been associated with greater odds of divorce. And while some of the newer studies show that there may be a weakening of this association, no study to date has ever shown cohabitation to have a protective factor on divorce. At best, we're trying to find ways that those who cohabit can potentially be as good as those who didn't, those who followed the chastity ethic that Dr. Fagan highlights and talks about. But we have to get into that rationale and that understanding that they actually believe that this will help marriages. That's the rationale that teens and young adults are resonating with. And we have to not only get to the pattern, but we have to get to the logic and expose where it is indeed paradoxical. And even though it's believed to be a logical belief, the test drive idea sounds quite logical. You wouldn't buy a car without test driving it, right? But that principle doesn't apply to marriage, and it doesn't fit to the pattern. Another example ties in very nicely with some of the data points that Dr. Fagan emphasized is what we could call the sowing wild oats paradox. I hear this talk all the time in my research on young adults across our culture. They talk all the time about, well, the young adult time period is the time to sexually experiment, to have those sexual experiences and patterns. Because after all, don't you need to get this out of your system? So then you get it out of your system, and our language as a culture is that then this helps people be ready to settle down. Well, all of the evidence shows us that quite the opposite is happening, that instead of settling down, what we see is a pattern, nothing's getting out of the system, it's getting into the system. And we see that those with higher patterns of sexual promiscuity, with more sexual partners, actually have higher likelihood of divorce, not lower. Again, a paradox, a logic that doesn't fit and doesn't work. The sexual chemistry paradox is an extension of this. This is the belief and need that we need to test sexual chemistry within a relationship, that you shouldn't move to later stages of commitment until you've tested this and made sure that it's a strong and compatible part of your relationship. Again, the research shows a pattern of sexual restraint, a pattern of connecting it to full commitment creates patterns where we see the real lowering of relationship dissolution risk. All of this can be tied together into this older is better paradox. Too many of our young people today are growing up in a culture that sees marriage as a transition of loss rather than a transition of gain. A number of years ago, I worked as a visiting scholar for the National Healthy Marriage Resource Center. We conducted focus groups all across the country. This was what the focus groups talked about. The young 20-somethings talked about how marriage would ultimately take from them, what they would lose, what they'd have to give up, what they'd stop doing, rather than the historical pattern we've seen of marriage as a transition of gain. After the teenage years, age of marriage is actually a pretty weak associated factor with marital success. Rather than selecting arbitrary ages, we need to start teaching and fostering a culture of real maturation and marriage readiness, teaching the real foundation factors that we know to be the key elements. Religious faith has been a key factor of that, relationship skills, understandings of real maturity and patterns that create that. When our young people have found that actually ought to be the time that they move forward with marriage, rather than there being so much of a culture the other direction. Finally, I just highlight with you this idea that I said that it's not just one of delay, but a new trend that we need to be paying more and more attention to is marriage foregone. That ultimately it's not just one of delay, but for an increasing segment of our society, marriage is lost altogether. And Dr. Wilcox will highlight in ways where patterns, I think, tied to marriage and family formation have significant impacts. But when we get to the point of 1 in 5, 1 in 3 of individuals not experiencing marriage across the life course, that's a dramatic social change. And just as a final reminder here, remember that ultimately it is those that are least advantaged in our society that are being most impacted by these changes. We have to keep a view across the full range and segment of society, because this is where we're starting to see patterns in our culture and society that are indeed best labeled as divergent destinies. Thank you.